Every culture on Earth, separated by oceans, by millennia, by languages that share not a single syllable, drew the same symbols, built the same political structures, and organized their kingdoms by the same rules. That is either the greatest coincidence in human history, or it is something else entirely. Today, we are pulling apart a body of research that asks exactly that question. By the end of this episode, you will understand what iconographic writing actually is and why it matters. You will grasp the grand arbitration hypothesis and the profound question it poses about justice and civilization, and you will have a framework for thinking about archaic history that is genuinely unlike anything taught in a standard university course. I am joined by someone who has spent considerable time with this research, and I want to start right at the beginning, because the author, who publishes under the name An Unknown Soldier, makes a claim in the very first pages that stopped me cold. Over to you.
Right, so the claim that stops you cold is this. In 2011, the author deciphered a writing system in widespread use throughout what he calls the archaic world, and he dates that writing system to 77,000 BC, following the Toba supereruption in Indonesia.
77,000 BC. That is not a typo.
It is absolutely not a typo. And the author is aware of exactly how that lands. He writes, and I am quoting directly from the research, that his cage was pretty small, meaning everything he had learned at university required civilization to fit neatly into a cage no greater than 5,000 years by 5,000 years. Iconographic writing in 80,000 BC was, in his own words, just not possible.
So he is arguing against his own prior assumptions. That is actually quite a rigorous starting point.
It is, and it is one of the things that makes the research genuinely interesting rather than just provocative. He is not asking you to simply believe him. He is walking you through the process by which he arrived at conclusions he himself initially resisted.
So let us ground this properly. Before we get to the grand arbitration, we need to understand the framework the author is working within. He proposes a completely different way of periodizing history. Walk me through that.
Yes, so the author proposes we retire terms like Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, he calls those anachronisms, and replace them with two broad categories, the archaic and the ancient. The archaic world, in his framework, spans from the Toba eruption of 80,000 BC to approximately 1,800 BC. The ancient world then runs from 1,800 BC through to the Common Era.
And why 1,800 BC as the dividing line?
Because the author argues that something dramatic happens around that period, what modern academia describes as a Bronze Age collapse. But he is careful here. He says the written records of both Arabia and Asia allude to a period of conflict and reform that results in the world we know as classical antiquity. He is not entirely convinced it was a collapse. He raises the possibility that the diplomatic system recorded in the iconographic record may have simply reached its logical limits and broken down under its own weight.
That is a genuinely different framing. Not a collapse, but a system failure. Like a network going down rather than a city burning.
Exactly, and he is honest that it is too early to trust that intuition. He says so explicitly. But the question he leaves hanging is rather haunting. If civilization did not collapse, how did an information technology used throughout the world for millennia simply fade from memory?
Right, and that information technology is iconographic writing itself. So what actually is it? Because the name suggests something, but I suspect the reality is considerably more surprising.
Considerably more surprising, yes. The author defines iconographic writing as a system that modulates visual information rather than verbal information. And he is very precise about why that distinction matters, because a visual markup language, as he calls it, transcends language barriers. If you and I speak different languages, but we are both looking at the same map, we can still read the same document.
So it is not writing in the sense of encoding speech. It is writing in the sense of encoding meaning visually.
Precisely. And the most astonishing feature of this system, the one the author says he himself initially refused to believe, is that the primary container for every composition is cartographic. Every document in this system is built on an accurate map of the realm it describes.
Wait, so these are not decorative objects. They are constitutional documents disguised as art.
That is exactly what the author argues. He lays out 3 compositional rules of syntax. Rule 1, the Constitution had to look just like the realm it documented, borders and general details all based on cartography. Rule 2, the king had to look like the kingdom. And Rule 3, every station of the nobility and many domains of the learned had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, almost always in geophysical relationship to each other.
So the king's headdress is not ceremonial decoration. It is a map of his territory worn on his head.
That is the argument, yes. And the author uses the Egyptian pantheon to demonstrate it. Take Horus. He argues that Horus originates in geology, specifically the geology of Egypt west of the Nile, which he says resembles a perched Egyptian black kite. The founding iconography depicts Horus in full avian form, but the king would always wear a Horus headdress because the king had to look like the kingdom.
And the Great Pyramids of Giza fit into this somehow, don't they?
They do, and this is where it gets rather extraordinary. In iconographic compositions, the author says the nose of the figure always represented the sovereign's mountain, the high point from which the king would reign. Egypt's problem was that there are no appreciable mountains along the Nile Delta. So the solution, he argues, was to build mountains. And the Great Pyramids of Giza are situated precisely on the nose of Horus in the iconographic composition.
So the pyramids are not tombs first. They are geopolitical markers.
According to this framework, yes. And the mechanism by which all of this cartographic precision was achieved is what the author calls soloromancy.
Soloromancy. That sounds like something from a fantasy novel.
It does, but the technical process is remarkably straightforward. The author describes it using Moses on Mount Sinai as his primary example. You place a staff upright in the ground beneath the sun. You mark the tip of its shadow with a stone. Later in the afternoon, the shadow has moved. You mark the new tip, draw a line between the two stones, and you have a perfect east to west line. The author says this technique remains more accurate than modern GPS satellites.
A stick and two stones. That is the technology underpinning a global writing system.
A stick and two stones, yes. From that east-west baseline, a soloromancer, that caste of the clergy dedicated to interpreting solar phenomena, could then measure azimuths to every prominent feature on the horizon and trace those lines onto a cloth. The author walks through Moses doing exactly this across the Sinai Peninsula over 40 years, building up a map of the kingdom of Midian with extraordinary fidelity.
And the burning bush that was not consumed, that is the iconographic record of what Moses saw?
That is the author's argument. He correlates the phonetic record in Exodus with the iconography and concludes that the burning bush is a cartographic composition, a visual document of the wadis and ridgelines of the Sinai, rendered in the iconographic writing system. The bush that burned but was not consumed is, in his reading, a map.
I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is either completely wrong or it reframes one of the most famous moments in religious history entirely.
And the author is not asking you to accept it on faith. He says explicitly, use Google Earth, turn off all borders and labels, and look at the geology yourself. He is inviting verification, not demanding belief.
Now, before we get to the grand arbitration, I want to flag the two physical examples the author uses to anchor all of this, because they are the empirical foundation of the whole argument. The Dama de Elche and the Bryn Celthley pattern stone.
Yes, and these are important. The Bryn Celthley pattern stone is where the discovery began, in 2011, in Cardiff at the National Museum of Wales. The stone was discovered buried beneath a mound on the Isle of Anglesey in 1929, in archaeological contexts radiocarbon dated to 3500 BC. The author's analysis of it runs to over 200 pages.
200 pages for a single stone.
200 pages. But he says the Dama de Elche makes a more compelling case, so he leads with that in the research. The Dama de Elche is a carved bust from around 400 BC, found in Spain, once believed to be a Carthaginian funerary urn. The author places it in profile next to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal and argues the correlation is, in his words, nearly irrefutable.
The carving is a map of the Iberian Peninsula.
That is the argument, and he says, if you conclude cartography was not possible in 400 BC, you will forgive the international incident he caused in Cardiff when he first doubted the integrity of the pattern stone. He is being wry about it, but the point is serious. He initially dismissed his own findings and then found corroborating evidence that forced him to reconsider.
Right. So now we have the framework, we have the writing system, we have the mechanism of soloromancy. Let us get to the grand arbitration, because that is the hypothesis at the heart of this episode.
Mhm.
What is it?
The grand arbitration is the author's attempt to resolve a doubt that kept surfacing throughout his research. At every juncture, he found himself asking, could all the similarities between regional iconography simply be chalked up to a common source, astronomy? We all look at the same stars. There are only so many patterns they will form, and there are only a finite number of methods for documenting those patterns.
That is actually a very reasonable objection. Independent invention is a well-established phenomenon in the history of science.
It is, and the author grants it fully. He says he still believes it is more likely that a number of scribes in diverse regions of the world all invented iconographic writing independently. But, and this is the crucial turn, it was not the astronomical geometry that rattled his cage, it was the socio-political metaphors to which the iconography was applied.
Meaning the symbols themselves might be coincidental, but the way they were used, the political meaning attached to them, that is where the real puzzle is.
Exactly. He asks, what manner of coincidence would result in near-perfect parity between political systems across the entire planet? And that is when he arrived at the concept of the grand arbitration. He defines it as a historically subconscious tendency of just societies to modulate toward a socio-political optimal.
So it is not that someone invented a perfect system of government and exported it. It is that, given enough time and the right conditions, any just society will independently arrive at the same solution.
That is the hypothesis, yes. He frames it with a question. If necessity is the mother of invention, and the rational actor is assumed to be at the wheel in just societies, how long would it take for any kindred group to arrive at a socio-political optimal, a form of government as just as it could become?
And the form of government the iconographic record documents consistently on every continent, from 80,000 BC to 1,500 BC, is what the author calls the Royal Republic. Yes. And he is explicit that this form of government has never been noted in any political science textbook in existence. He describes archaic monarchs, all monarchs in fact, as arbiters, negotiating the political ambitions of often rival factions to arrive at effective solutions for their realms. That is the mundane, everyday sort of arbitration he refers to throughout the research. The grand arbitration is the macro-scale version of that same process playing out across all of human history.
So the king is not a tyrant. The king is a negotiator, a constitutional figure in a system that is far more sophisticated than we have given it credit for. That is the implication, yes. And the iconographic compositions, those constitutional documents we discussed earlier, are the evidence. They are not art. They are records of the structure and function of these royal republics, rendered in a writing system that was legible across language barriers.
Now, I want to push back slightly here because the author himself pushes back on his own hypothesis. He says he has already dismissed the grand arbitration as something that may have, but likely did not occur. So why explore it at all?
He addresses that directly. He says, entertaining a hypothesis is where all science starts. Few scientific discoveries end where they begin, so there is little use in exploring discarded possibilities unless it is to explore the process. He is modeling scientific thinking, not claiming certainty.
Which is actually quite refreshing in a field where extraordinary claims tend to come with extraordinary confidence.
It is. And the alternative explanation he favors, that the iconographic morphology leads back to the Indonesian island of Kalimantan with axiomatic protocols operative there in 80,000 BC, is itself an extraordinary claim. He acknowledges that too. He says his audience will learn in the coming years that he did establish iconographic morphology leading back to Kalimantan, but he does not want to foreclose the grand arbitration as a possibility worth examining.
So the two possibilities are, either all of this iconographic similarity traces back to a single origin point in Indonesia, or it is the result of independent convergence, the grand arbitration, where just societies across the world arrived at the same answers independently.
Those are the two poles, yes. And the author is honest that the evidence for the Kalimantan origin is stronger in his view. But the grand arbitration raises a question that is philosophically significant regardless of which explanation is correct. Is justice an historical undercurrent? Does it operate beneath the surface of human civilization as a kind of gravitational force, pulling societies toward the same optimal?
And if it is, then who is the grand arbiter? The author raises that question, and then, rather tantalizingly, declines to answer it directly.
He does. He says the children of the book have an answer, and he will spare us his own answer for now. It is a deliberate provocation. He wants the listener to sit with the question.
Now, there is something else in the research that I think deserves attention, because it speaks to the sheer chronological depth of what is being claimed. The Rising Star Cave Complex.
Yes, the author mentions a ritual interment in the Rising Star Cave Complex in southern Africa, dated to 365,000 BC, which included an elk claw talisman buried presumably with its owner. He raises this as a spoiler, suggesting that the Bantu of Africa may have preserved examples of mankind's iconographic writing system from as far back as 365,000 BC.
365,000 BC. That is not just before recorded history. That is before the species we call modern humans is conventionally thought to have existed.
Which is precisely why the author says he began to sound, in his own words, like one of those religious nuts who speak of antediluvians. He is aware of how it reads, but he is pointing to physical evidence, a ritual interment with a symbolic object, and asking what that implies about the cognitive and cultural sophistication of whoever placed it there.
And there is a tangent here that I find almost as fascinating as the main argument, the Arabian regalia, because the author does not just claim that ancient iconography was information technology. He argues it still is, in a sense.
This is one of the more striking passages in the research. He looks at the regalia of the Arabian nobility, the bisht robe, the agal rope headdress, and argues that these are not ceremonial. The gold border on the robe represents the line of solar progress. When laid flat on the ground, like a prayer rug, it forms a perfect east to west line. The agal functions as a compass, complete with azimuth indicators. He uses a photograph of His Highness Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the Emir of Dubai, to illustrate the point.
So the Bedouin nobility were, in effect, wearing their maps. Dressed in nothing more than a bisht and agal, they were never lost.
That is the author's argument, yes. And he extends it to rugs, suggesting that the most complete details of a realm would have been woven into rug designs, with secrets recorded on the underside, disguised as finishing knots. It is a remarkable claim, but it is consistent with the broader logic of the system. Information technology embedded in everyday objects.
Now, I want to address the scope problem, because the author is admirably candid about it. He notes that in the British Isles alone, there are over 3 million artifacts in the national collections of England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. If he devoted 5 minutes to each, he would need to work for 150 years just to complete a first pass.
And globally, he says there are hundreds of millions of artifacts in the world's museums, the majority of which will have iconographic significance and therefore require study, interpretation, peer review, and authentication. He says it would take him 2 centuries of toil just to form a comprehensive opinion. He is not being falsely modest, he is being genuinely precise about the limits of what one person can accomplish.
Which raises the question of what it would take to actually verify or falsify this. Because the author is not just making a claim about a few artifacts. He is proposing a complete reinterpretation of the archaeological record.
He is, and he acknowledges that explicitly. He says the scope of this discovery is so massive that it requires the dedicated efforts of a generation to complete. He is priming the thread, as he puts it, offering a first interpretation, not a final one. He says future generations will complete the work.
And the Egyptian connection is worth dwelling on because it is where the author identifies what he calls the morphological interface between iconographic writing and pictographic writing.
Yes. He argues that Egyptian hieroglyphics were an innovation on the existing iconographic writing system, invented by Egyptian scribes beginning with the First Dynasty. In his analogy, Egypt upgraded to Twitter while her neighbors remained with conventional mail. As a result, conversations in Egypt were preserved in the phonetic record, whereas conversations in Europe and elsewhere were obscured. His discovery, he says, reveals what was obscured.
That is a genuinely elegant way of framing it. The hieroglyphics are not the origin of writing. They are a local upgrade of a much older, much more widespread system.
And each Egyptian god, in his analysis, is a bust depicting regional geology of Africa in what he calls anamorphic similes. If your kingdom looked like a pintail duck, the head of your king was always depicted as a man with a pintail duck's head. That is it. That is the origin of the Egyptian pantheon. in his framework.
So the gods are not supernatural beings. They are cartographic portraits of kingdoms.
In this framework, yes. And the author says that once you see it, it is nearly impossible to go back to believing these iconographs are idols. He makes that point specifically in the context of ISIS destroying ancient iconography in northern Iraq and Syria on the grounds that it is idolatry. He argues that an idol is only an idol as long as you think it is an idol. Once you recognize archaic iconography for what it is, graven images recording geology, the charge of idolatry simply does not hold.
That is a striking political and theological implication buried in what is ostensibly a linguistic discovery.
The research is full of those. The author is not just making an archaeological argument, he is making an argument about how we understand religion, governance, and the deep history of human communication simultaneously.
So, when you step back from all of this, the iconographic writing system, the soloromancy, the Royal Republic, the Grand Arbitration, what is the single most important thing a listener should take away?
I think it is this. The author is not asking you to accept that civilization is older than we thought. He is asking you to consider what it would mean if it were. Because if the iconographic record is what he says it is, a global, consistent, sophisticated information technology operative from 77,000 BC, then the story we tell ourselves about human progress is not just incomplete. It may be inverted.
Inverted how?
We tend to think of civilization as a linear ascent, from primitive to sophisticated, from tribal to constitutional, from local to global. But if the Royal Republic was operative on every continent from 80,000 BC to 1,500 BC, then what we call the ancient world, Greece, Rome, classical antiquity, may not be the beginning of sophisticated governance. It may be a reconstruction of something far older that was lost or that broke down.
And the Grand Arbitration sits at the center of that question. Because if just societies naturally converge on the same optimal, if justice is, as the author puts it, an historical undercurrent, then the loss of that system is not just a historical curiosity. It is a live question about where we are headed.
Precisely. The author asks, if the Grand Arbitration is indeed operative in the scope of history, who then is the Grand Arbiter? He declines to answer. But the question itself is the point. It asks us to consider whether justice is something we invented or something we keep rediscovering.
And the research suggests we may have rediscovered it many times, independently, across every continent, over tens of thousands of years, which is either the most hopeful thing about human nature or the most humbling.
Both, I think. The author is careful not to romanticize it. He is not saying the archaic world was a utopia. He is saying it had a level of political and communicative sophistication that we have systematically underestimated, and that the evidence for that is sitting in museums around the world, waiting to be read.
Over 3 million artifacts in the British Isles alone, hundreds of millions globally. Each one potentially a constitutional document, a census, a map of a kingdom that has no name in any history book.
And the author is honest that he has read only a fraction of the record. He says future generations will complete the work. He is not the conclusion of this story. He is, as he puts it, the one holding the ball, and he is running with it.
Here is what this really comes down to, I think. An unknown soldier, a researcher publishing under a pseudonym, crediting the United States Armed Forces with the training that made the discovery possible, has proposed that the most fundamental assumptions of modern archaeology, linguistics, and political science may need to be revisited. Not because of a single dramatic find, but because of a method. A way of reading objects that have been sitting in plain sight for centuries.
And the method itself is verifiable. He is not asking you to take his word for it. He is saying, open Google Earth, turn off the labels, look at the geology, and tell me what you see. The Dama de Elche next to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal. The nose of Horus aligned with the Great Pyramids of Giza. The burning bush as a cartographic composition of the Sinai Peninsula. These are not interpretations you have to accept. They are observations you can make yourself.
And the Grand Arbitration, even if the author himself has provisionally dismissed it as the primary explanation, leaves us with a question that is worth carrying around. If just societies trend toward an optimal structure, if justice is an historical undercurrent rather than a modern achievement, then what does that say about the societies we are building right now?
It says that the work of building just institutions is not new. It may be the oldest work there is. And the iconographic record, if the author is right, is the evidence that human beings have been doing it and documenting it for far longer than we ever imagined.
We began this episode with a question. Is the similarity between archaic cultures across the world the greatest coincidence in human history, or is it something else entirely? The research of an unknown soldier does not give you a clean answer. It gives you something better, a method for asking the question properly, and a provocation that is genuinely hard to dismiss once you have sat with it. The grand arbiter, whoever or whatever that is, has apparently been at work for a very long time.